Our first speaker in this session is Lain Jager. Lain is known to many of us here owing to his 9 years of CEO of Zespri from 2008 to 2017. During his tenure as CEO, grower returns doubled and the Zespri share price grew from $1 to $8, despite Zespri having to deal with the impact of PSA. Lain was also the chairman of the Primary Sector Council, which produced the Fit for a Better World report, which focused on New Zealand's food and fibre sector. Today, Lain is involved in a range of investment projects in tourism and agribusiness. He also serves as a director on several boards and is the co-chair of Te Puna Whakaaranui, a food and fibre think tank. Given Lain's outstanding wealth of experience, I'm delighted that he's agreed to share with us his views on New Zealand's food sector, the new normal. Please join with me in welcoming Lain to the podium.
Kia ora tātou. It's a real privilege to be with you this morning. Just putting myself on the clock. So, we live in extraordinary times. Food safety takes place in the context of global value chains that span from genetics through to consumers around the world. This presentation is a walkthrough of contextual factors impacting those global food and fibre value chains. You can have a copy of these slides, feel free to take pictures of them, the content is yours. When we think about the unprecedented change confronting us, climate change, demographics, technology, and geopolitics are driving unprecedented levels of that change. And I say that in the context of the whole of human history. If this feels different, it's because it is different. As principally a science audience, you are all intimately acquainted with climate change, and in fact, most of you are far better qualified than I am in this space. When we talk about climate change, we tend to characterise it in terms of changes to the average temperature globally, to the impact of floods and droughts, to the impact on global yields, and of course on biodiversity. Commercially, what we're seeing is unprecedented impacts on natural food production systems. And in particular, yields globally are coming under pressure. That's actually good for us in New Zealand because it means the demand side will be strong. We're getting whacked by climate change, but our competition is even more impacted than what we are. Something of a silver lining, I guess, although saying that to farmers who have just been impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle is cold comfort. The other impact of climate change is it's driving investment in modern foods, particularly in precision fermentation, in cellular agriculture, and in vertical farming systems. We're also seeing governments respond with a focus on risk, on food security, and very, very extensive investments in technology, which I'll touch on presently. We don't talk much about demographics, but the ageing demographic that we're seeing globally is having a massive impact. That's because an ageing population is stagflationary. What you get is desaving consumption, but actually with a lack of productivity growth. We're seeing soaring costs of superannuation and healthcare, fewer younger workers supporting more older people, ironically a shortage of labour, and in those countries where populations are actually contracting, what we're seeing is a reduction in both growth and asset prices. We're also seeing a diverging interests of younger people and older people putting pressure on democracies globally. This is particularly tough in Europe, in Japan, and increasingly in China. Ironically, India, the US, China, and Mexico are in a somewhat better position demographically. Almost by definition, science audiences across technology, you're aware of the S-curves that take place with new technology adoption. What we're seeing is very significant levels of change in the energy sector, in the transport sector, in materials, in food, and in information, including in AI. In food, that's about precision fermentation, it's about cellular agriculture, it's about vertical farming systems. All of this is happening in the context of decarbonisation. And interestingly, while we talk a lot about ESG, actually what we're seeing around the world from a policy perspective is a real focus on industrial policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about industrial policy shortly. Rapidly evolving technology is our best chance of mitigating against climate change and also driving productivity, which is just critical in the context of our ageing demographic. But make no mistake, there is enormous societal transformation to come. And at this moment, AI is very present in all of our minds. Goldman Sachs tells us 300 million jobs over the next 10 years, white-collar jobs, will come out of economies as a consequence of AI. One of the things which is very confronting is it's very difficult to predict the impacts of these technologies as they intersect. I'm going to touch on geopolitics, very important to us here in New Zealand as a small trading nation. So, of course, when we talk about geopolitics, the tendency is to talk about that in terms of the interactions between nations. But actually what drives it is the interactions within countries. So global debt levels are high around the world. You can see the slide behind me. To give you a context, we're slightly better off here in New Zealand with around about 180% in this context of public and private debt combined in New Zealand. Most of that being private debt. Our government has been relatively good, although it has to be because we have a poor balance of payments. One of the things that these sorts of numbers don't take into account is the concept of implicit debt. So by implicit debt, I mean unfunded future commitments. So here in New Zealand, we could talk about things like roading, the increase in costs of healthcare, the impacts of an ageing population, underfunded pensions, water management costs, the costs of adapting to climate change. And so while our explicit debt is high, the implicit debt confronting us globally is massive. And that's why that technological change is just so important to us. These debt levels, the very best prognosis is that these high debt levels weigh on growth globally. If it goes badly for us, what we will see is inequality and people not being able to participate in our communities, the pressure on the standard of living, destabilising democracies around the world. When we talk about this in the context of the interactions between nations, we're seeing a marked change with China and the US decoupling and a strategic competition playing out, particularly in the technology space. A lot of that is driven by the US not being reliant on foreign oil anymore. And so you're seeing quite a different agenda from the US globally. We're also seeing pressure on rules-based global institutions. And so where globalisation was flourishing, we are now seeing the emergence of trade blocs, and that has deep implications for us here in New Zealand. I want to touch on this idea of industrial policy. So in the context of this technological change, in the context of decarbonisation, in the context of pressure on global food systems, what we are seeing is we're seeing countries around the world take very strong actions to secure their economies, and it's about finding a place in this new world. So we've seen, you can see on the slide up there, the Green Deal up in Europe, $1 trillion being spent in their food system, and a whole bunch of EU farm targets. But it's not just in the food area that we're seeing these industrial policies. It is in energy, in the production of semiconductors around the world, huge investments in climate change, batteries, particularly in Japan. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing nations around the world ask the question, what is our place in the sun in the emerging global economy? In general, countries implement industrial policy where they see advantage or where they feel that they need to from a security perspective. So China, for instance, has an industrial policy to become food secure over the next 10 years. When we think about industrial policy here in New Zealand, I'm going to switch now my focus and just focus on the so what in the New Zealand context for a few slides. When we think about industrial policy in the New Zealand economy, there are really two sectors of our economy where you would say, hey, industrial policy makes sense. One is energy. One of the benefits we have in New Zealand is we have a very high percentage of our electricity, about 85%, comes from renewable sources. Now, in fact, we need to double the amount of electricity we produce in the next 10 to 15 years if we are to electrify the economy, and we need to electrify the economy if we are to decarbonise the economy. So decarbonisation means electrification. We already benefit from a high level of renewables. We've got to double that amount of renewables. One of the opportunities there is we could become energy independent, which would be massive for our economy in the context of the balance of payments. The second area is actually our food economy. And the reason is because it's about 10% of GDP. Let's call it, we've heard a couple of different numbers this morning already, but let's call it $55 million of exports. There is an opportunity to continue to grow those exports while reducing the carbon impact of our primary sector. And so food is the second area where we might be ambitious about industrial policy. When we look at what we're doing currently, we do have industrial policy, and so the government has just invested together with business in a private-public partnership, and that's important, about $340 million in methane mitigation. That is an example of industrial policy which is on strategy for New Zealand because it enables us to continue to grow our primary sector while mitigating carbon emissions. That investment, in our assessment, is inadequate relative to the challenge ahead of us. It is a time to be brave and decisive from a public policy perspective. New Zealand's innovation system has major weaknesses. I feel nervous talking about this with a science audience. This is going to sound gratuitous, but I don't mean it to be. I just need to be quite blunt for a moment. On the one hand, we have some fantastic scientists in New Zealand. On the one hand, our science system is underfunded, and it is not mission-driven enough. The relationships between business and science are not strong enough, and we're not competitive globally. It is time for us to be very determined and focused about this, because our science community and the partnerships between science and business are fundamental if we are to create a bright future for New Zealand. When I think about the innovation system in the context of the food and fibre sector, It's not just about our science community. It is about continuing to grow our large food value chains, specifically dairy, meat, forestry, kiwi fruit, wine, apples and fishing. And that's because they're the base. That is our $55 billion of exports currently. But we also need to create new billion-dollar industries, because we won't continue to grow the food and fibre sector without new large businesses. It is about increasing investment in R&D with a focus on mission-based funding, and it is about creating a vibrant commercialisation ecosystem with a strong focus on private-public partnerships. That methane JV is on the right track. We need more of those, and we need them focused very commercially. This is an urgent dialogue because we are seeing massive investments right along value chains, and those value chains are evolving rapidly. The idea a really interesting idea is I reckon it'll take 3 years before most of us have AI assistants. And those AI assistants will have our health data. They'll be recommending menus for us. They'll be ordering food for us. And so just think about the depth of that change. Women are still the primary shoppers in households around the world. Within a decade, that's unlikely to be the case. It'll be AI assistants. Massive change to our food value chains. We have a lot of work to do here in New Zealand. I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time. I just want to touch on this idea of new billion-dollar industries. One of the advantages we have, and it's one of the few advantages we have, is New Zealand is like a dining room. Most of us know each other. We can have these conversations. There are opportunities in natural health products and alternative production systems, in genetic technology, in the blue economy, in oceans, really exciting, and in personalised nutrition. There are opportunities. We will need to create new value chains to enable us to participate in those opportunities. That does require public-private investment. We will need to be courageous. We also have almost cultural constraints. We struggle to do things at scale in New Zealand. We don't like to have really blunt conversations. We're careful of each other. We do need strong regulatory change. We need to invest strongly in our innovation system. We need to capitalise the development of some of these new value chains, and we need to invest very heavily in human capability. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in extraordinary times. We will not be successful if we just continue on our current trajectory. We need to be bold. We need to have brave conversations. We need to take responsibility for taking this country forward. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Lain. There will be time for questions. So I've got some for a start. So who here feels a little bit scared about the future now after hearing that talk? Who feels excited about it? Who feels inspired? Right, okay. Yes, a lot of emotions. Okay, thank you very much, Lain. So do we have some questions for Lain? And there is a microphone roaming around. While that's going, I'll start off. So what's the single most important thing we can do to make a difference to the food industry in the future?
Look, I think we need to be really careful about the dialogues we have in New Zealand. You're all aware of the polarisation in New Zealand, where, on the one hand, we are rightly really concerned about our environment, about the quality of our waterways, about the emissions coming from the food and fibre sector. And there is a dialogue that the food and fibre sector isn't getting on with change quickly enough. And that dialogue is fair. On the other hand, the actual challenge ahead of us is to continue to grow the sector, and in fact the whole economy, while we decarbonise. And that is something that we will have to do together. It's really, really difficult. It's not good enough to say, hey, let's shrink our way to sustainability, because economically we can't sustain our economy if we try to do that. And so what we need to do is find ways to continue to talk together and to have sensible dialogues that enable this country to move forward. And it's actually, so what we focus on is really important, and avoiding rabbit holes is really important.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'll go. Next question, is it?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, Rex. On your last slide, you had one of the opportunities as food as software. Could you expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of there's an idea that eventually we will be able to print food, that through precision fermentation, what we'll actually see is technology going into homes that enable people literally to dial up food production in their own homes. I think I would call that Horizon 2, Horizon 3 stuff. But I think it's also important to think about the way that food is delivered into homes. And so, you know, in all likelihood, we will see an evolution of value chains where people shop in an entirely different way, and they make their food choices in an entirely different way. I think we'll see a very nutrition-focused approach to food going into the future.
Hi there. Who do you think does it well? Like, who should we aspire to be following, or do you think we should be cutting our own path?
Oh, what a question. A couple of comments. First of all, I think from a public policy perspective, it's interesting to look at Canada and their approach to their food and fibre sector in the context of decarbonisation. Here in New Zealand, we tend to talk about what we've got to stop doing, with a particular focus on the dairy sector. Over in Canada, they're really talking about, what we can be doing together and what a growth-focused pathway looks like. So I think from a public policy perspective, Canada is interesting. I think in terms of what we're seeing from a technology perspective around the world, it really depends on what dimensions we're talking about. Obviously, Israel from an ecosystem perspective, and Holland from an ecosystem perspective are really, really interesting. I think some of the Nordic countries are interesting in terms of the approach they're taking to growing modern food industries.